Persona 5 Royal is probably my favourite game of all time, and a few years back when legends such as Yorbud Tevin, Jack Benzie and Nitsua Gamer were tearing up YouTube with incredible challenge runs of this game, I had an idea to make a challenge run of my own, a gun damage only run of Persona 5 Royal. But I procrastinated, and by the time I had finally decided to do the run for real, I was beaten to the punch. And the video is great, it's funny, it's got production value, and even opened my eyes to some potential roadblocks I hadn't even considered. Still, with that video on YouTube, what was the point in me trying to make my own? But eventually, I realised that I wanted to do the run for myself more than the video. And I'm glad I did do it. This run ended up being a lot of fun, so if you're interested in adding a twist to your next run of Persona 5 Royal, I highly recommend it. And there are a few bits of Ragnar's video that I would have done differently. So here are the rules for my gun-only run of Persona 5 Royal. Number 1, we can only deal damage to enemies with our guns or gun skills, with a caveat that comes later. Number 2, I'm playing on New Game Plus Merciless, but I haven't inherited the data from the previous file. Number 3, support, ailment and healing skills are all allowed, as are all passive skills. Number 4, DLC personas and items are also allowed, but the personas must be fused, so we can't just withdraw them from the compendium. And finally, number 5, as a last resort, freeze sprays can be used if you've exhausted all other methods and there is no other way of progressing. I specifically chose the freeze spray as the only item that we could use, since if an enemy is frozen, it loses its gun immunity. And with that in place, let's get started. Game begins with Joker and his crew escaping from a casino full of... You know what? You all know the story, so let's just focus on what we're all here for, the challenge itself. From now on, I won't be discussing story events or confidants unless they're critical to my strategy, and instead, we'll solely be focusing on the battles. We call our character Han Solo and skip through the first trip into Kamoshida's palace, since we don't have a gun yet. When we enter the palace for a second time, we actually have some preparation to do. The run begins as soon as Ryuji gives us a gun, but without a gun skill, there's no way we can deal enough damage to the Eligor in Ryuji's Awakening battle. So, we grind on this enemy outside the entrance to the training hall by repeatedly saving and reloading the game in the first safe room. Big shout out to this comment on Ragnar's video for this hint. By doing this, we can grind so that Arsene gets to level 5 and learns Dream Needle just in time for Ryuji's Awakening battle. We finally get ourselves a gun, and the rest of the tutorial battles are a breeze. I've equipped both Joker and Morgana with the Demonica device, a DLC item which affords gun amp, meaning all of our attacks are 50% stronger. This will be the default accessory for most battles going forwards, and it's why I've chosen the Demonica suit and haired outfits for the crew. Armed with Dream Needle, Eligor is still a challenge. The enemies deal a bunch of damage on Merciless, and Morgana's heals are still pretty weak. Still, after taking down the two Bicorns first, Eligor will eventually fall. The next battle of interest is Arn's Awakening fight. We guard with Ryuji to avoid his Magaru, which will one-shot us, whilst attacking and healing with the others. There's really not that much to say with this one. And from here on, the palace is also pretty simple. Armed with the Demonica devices, most enemies will fall in a single turn of gun attacks, with only the Agathions that resist gun being annoying. Once Arn learns Dormina, we can then sleep enemies for huge technical damage, and this strategy will work well for the majority of the early game palace exploration. The Archangel mini-boss isn't much to worry about. Guarding every other turn while whittling his health down with Joker is enough to defeat him. After this point, there are a few more Bereth around, who are the only enemy who null gun in this palace, but thankfully, since they're the Dire Shadow, they're easy enough to spot and therefore avoid. The two fights against guard captains really showcase the power of criticals and technicals, which we'll be abusing throughout the entirety of this run. So, after completing the palace in a single day, we've reached the treasure and can take on Shadow Kamoshida. This fight is a grind more than anything. However, I tried, and failed in this case, to execute a strategy to try and speed up this battle. The fight consists of 4 main phases. In the first phase, I attack with just Joker and Morgana, while using Arn and Ryuji to heal, buff, and debuff. By this point, I've fused some stronger personas, and have access to Snap for a higher damage gun attack. When the trophy becomes available to hit in phase 2, I focus attacks on it to prevent him from healing, much as you normally would do. Phase 3 sees cognitive versions of Mishima and Suzui to appear, and set up Shadow Kamoshida's gold medal spike. We have to guard through the first one, but Suzui is weak to gun, meaning when she appears, we can use that to baton pass to Joker and ensure she goes down easily. Finally, the last phase sees you choose to send a party member to steal Shadow Kamoshida's crown, and whilst they slowly get into position, you have to deal sufficient damage to Kamoshida to keep him distracted. I chose to send Morgana since I had already used up all of his ammunition. I'd kept some ammo with Arn and Ryuji for this point in the fight, as we need to do as much damage as possible. Once they're out, it's left to just Joker to deal all of the damage. It is possible, but it requires careful management of buffs and debuffs. And unfortunately I made a mistake, and I don't deal sufficient damage right at the very end. So now with Arn and Ryuji out of ammo, it's far less likely we'll be able to distract him. So I resigned myself to brute forcing the final stages of this fight. So after many turns of attacking and refusing to send someone to steal the crown every single time, Kamoshida will go down, and the first palace is cleared. Palace 2 sees us venture into Madarame's museum. The early enemies here are of no concern, and whilst we have to avoid the dire shadow Shikiaoji, progress is relatively serene. Our offense is boosted by Joker's shock modded gun received from EY, meaning technicals are even easier to exploit. Unfortunately, this is the time where I have to confess that my recordings of a few battles have been lost, including the Kamoshida Willseed boss, the Nue fight, when you return back into Madarame's palace, and also Yusuke's awakening. But each of these battles pretty much followed the same principle of shocking or sleeping an enemy before dealing massive technical damage. After Yusuke's awakening, the second half of the palace is much more frustrating. With Inugami and Mikami as regular enemies immune to gun, we avoid most of the battles. The next forced battle involves the Kurama Tengu mini-boss, but this can be dealt with in the usual way. What can't be dealt with the usual way is the battle with the three Mikami towards the very end of the palace. Mikami nulls gun, and I have no way of inflicting freeze without also causing damage. However, I had already foreseen this battle to be a potential issue, and I had thought about ways around preparing a strategy. Mikami will either use a basic attack, double fangs, or fray. Since I'm allowing repel skills, and since Mikami doesn't null either nuke or physical skills, I realized I could simply reflect the damage back onto the Mikamis. However, the first persona with repel nuke is Lilith at level 60, while Arahabiki repels physical skills at level 35. I had no intention of grinding all the way up to level 35 on the basic enemies at the start of Madarame's palace, so I came up with a different plan. I've used a Kaguya Picaro, with high counter, to reflect the Mikami's physical attacks. Kaguya is ideal for this purpose, as her unique trait boosts reflected damage. If I hadn't been lazy, I could have grinded her up even further to level 31, where she learns repel physical naturally, but I decided instead to do a Futaba and pray to the RNG gods. With it being a 3-on-1 fight, many runs ended quickly, with the Mikamis dogpiling on Joker. But after around 10 restarts, I finally got a successful run. With the Mikamis out of the way, the palace is essentially clear, but one last fight remains, the Arahabiki Willseed boss. This one was surprisingly possible. This Arahabiki only resists gun instead of repelling it for some reason. However, that doesn't mean the fight was easy. Arahabiki's combination of Brainjack and Map Sayo frequently will end runs very, very quickly, and Flash Bomb still deals a significant amount of damage. However, with liberal use of Domino and Sleep and Dizzy Vials, and Double Shot courtesy of my own Shikiauji, we were able to take it down. That just leaves Shadow Madarame, which would prove to be a decent challenge. The first phase is mostly a waiting game until we can slather him in the black paint that will leave him vulnerable to gun attacks. I focus on defeating the nose in order to avoid its dangerous maelstrom attack, which will devastate Ryuji if it hits. When Madarame starts making elemental fakes of himself, I chose simply to ignore the fakes and deal damage to Madarame himself. Shikiauji's double shot is very strong for this stage of the game, and it seems far more efficient to keep the damage on than wasting turns attacking the fakes. The others spend most of their time guarding or healing in order to avoid the worst of the attacks from the fakes. That doesn't fully protect them, and indeed Ryuji in particular gets knocked down on multiple occasions, but apart from one devastating turn right at the very end, we escape from the painter's clutches with relative ease. After a brief trip to mementos between palaces, our focus shifts to the Bank of Gluttony. The early mementos requests are all easily dealt with via technical damage, since none of them null gun. The Oni battles during the first true infiltration are more frustrating than dangerous. Once again, shock and sleep are our best friends, whilst double shot is still racking up the damage. Makoto's Awakening fight is a very similar affair. We focus damage on the central Suiki since it's the largest threat. With Makoto, we get access to Forget as a status, which, whilst not providing technical opportunities, is very useful in this palace. Its ability to incapacitate enemies is invaluable in battles such as these, with multiple foes that resist gun. Speaking of multiple foes, the 4 Orobas that block our path are a pain. I went into this fight underprepared, a resist fire persona would have helped out a lot. Instead, the main focus is applying ailments to incapacitate foes, since 3 or 4 rounds of Miragi will easily take us out. Thankfully, we eventually get a run where they don't dodge our ailments, and we can use technical damage off of sleeps and shocks to slowly thin the numbers and eventually finish them off. The rest of the early palace is once again not that bad, with most groups of enemies easily managed with our usual strategies. For the first time we can also take out the Dire Shadow, Takemi Nakata, who's just as vulnerable to technicals as any other shadow. Once we enter the vault though, those pesky enemies who null gun do rear their unwelcome heads though. Rakshasa and Yaxani making fights with the regular shadows a pain. Moving onwards, the next mandatory fight is against Kinki, Suiki and Fuki. Having fought both Fuki and Suiki before, we deal with them first in the usual manner. Whilst Kinki requires the same approach that we took with the Makamis back in Madarame's palace. That is, hunker down with a persona that can reflect physical attacks and wait for him to defeat himself. By this point, I had fused away Kaguya Picaro since leveling her up was proving a pain. You can no doubt see by this point that I was quite lazy and had no intentions of actually min-maxing every bit of this challenge. Instead, at this point I have my own Kinki, whose natural resistance to physical attacks actually increases my survivability a lot, but is also why this battle takes many turns. I also cannot use Kaguya's unique trait, so I have to resort to just a 2x boost to reflected damage instead of a 3x boost, again making the battle go on for more turns than was probably necessary. The rest of the vault goes relatively smoothly, and I'm able to take down both the Kumbanda mini-boss and the Kerberos Willseed boss with technicals. You can see that by this point I have modded my party's members' guns with freeze or shock. I had been solely focusing on boosting my guts in the real world in order to reach rank 4 as soon as possible in order to start EY's Confidant for this very purpose. Since having ailment opportunities on most party members makes all of the difference in this and in future palaces as well. So that leaves us with Shadow Kaneshiro, and if you've seen Ragnar's video already, you'll know that this is where his challenge ended. You must be wondering if I've found some exploit to make this battle possible. And well, I tried, but I'm pretty confident in saying that the second phase of this fight is impossible gun only. So, Kaneshiro has a fixed pattern in this second phase of using Lullaby followed by Snap on an asleep party member. I have a Kinky with Repel Gun, but Kaneshiro himself nulls Gun, meaning I have no way of dealing damage since the reflected damage still has Gun characteristics. Even if Joker is the only character left, and Kaneshiro knows that he cannot damage him with Snap, he does not change his pattern from what I can see. I saw one post on the Japanese wiki which seemed to claim that he might use Zionga at some point in the fight, but I've never seen this, never had this happen to me, and I couldn't find any evidence of it anywhere else. So if someone does have any information or any other ideas as to how we could approach this fight, I'd be really happy to hear them, because at the moment this does seem impossible. For the reference, I can't reflect his henchman's attacks back at him, they obviously just reflect back at the henchman. And the henchmen themselves are immune to brainwash, which was my other thought, if I could brainwash the enemies and get them to damage Kaneshiro for me, but that also doesn't work. And so, with great reluctance, I had to resort to my Rule 5 here. But first, the Pickytron section is nothing special. Double Shot does great damage, and I have personas that resist its physical attacks. Buffs and debuffs are as valuable as they always are, and I do take the opportunity to distract him with the expensive item for some free turns of damage. In the second phase, once the goons are out, we can do the fight almost as intended and wreck them with technical damage. And then once Kaneshiro is finally alone, we can turn to our final recourse, the freeze spray. He's not even vulnerable to freeze in the end, despite being vulnerable to other ailments. So it just takes 20 turns of using freeze sprays, and with the feeling of disappointment still lodged in our stomach, we complete the bank and look towards the next challenge. I'll see you in part 2.